In the fall of 2024, Ukrainian and Western officials sounded the alarm. Over 10,000 North Korean troops had arrived in Russia. This number alone was enough to raise some serious concerns. 10,000 North Korean soldiers, known for their discipline and willingness to follow orders no matter the cost, were now standing by to join Russia's war effort. But the real nightmare? That 10,000 was just the beginning. Reports warned of a terrifying possibility. 100,000 North Korean troops could soon flood the battlefield. Just imagine wave after wave of soldiers, relentless, obedient, and ready to fight. An army of that size wouldn't just reinforce Russia, it would change the game. But then their moment finally came. Their first taste of real action. Except they didn't strike fear. They didn't crush Ukrainian positions. They didn't change the course of the war. No, these so-called reinforcements managed one thing and one thing only. They killed their own. They killed Russians, the very people they were sent to help. Here's how North Korea's big debut in the Russo-Ukrainian War turned into Russia's latest humiliation. This embarrassing event took place in the Kursk Oblast, a region in western Russia. Of course, this location is by no means surprising, as the North Korean troops were primarily sent to Russia to take back this region. You see, back in August, Ukrainian forces stunned everyone with a shock offensive across the border, seizing nearly 500 square miles of Russian territory, launching a counterattack in September. By late November, the Russian forces clawed back about 40% of the land they'd lost. The North Korean troops reportedly helped the Russians to do so, but initially it wasn't by fighting. Initially, the North Koreans were kept in supportive roles, freeing up Russian forces so they could head to the front lines. They dug trenches, built fortifications, and handled the grunt work that Russia's exhausted troops no longer had the manpower for. It wasn't glamorous in any way, but it served a purpose. Then, as the fighting in Kursk intensified, the North Koreans were finally sent into combat, and now we see why this decision took so long. On December 14, 2024, the Defense Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, GUR, reported via its website and Telegram channel that a group of North Korean soldiers opened fire on the vehicles of a unit fighting alongside Russian forces. That's right, they opened friendly fire. And it wasn't just a stray shot or two. This epic blunder left 8 soldiers dead. But it gets even better, or worse, depending on who you ask. The ill-fated troops weren't just any Russian foot soldiers. They weren't your average conscripts. No, these were members of the so-called Akhmat battalions, some of the most loyal and feared troops in the Russian army. If you know anything about the conflict in Ukraine, you'll recognize these so-called Kadyrovites as some of the most brutal and effective fighters in the Russian arsenal. They've been active since the very first days of the war, and their reputation precedes them. Officially known as the 141st Special Motorized Regiment, the Akhmat Special Forces aren't your typical military unit. They're mostly made up of non-Chechen volunteers from all across Russia, and they're loyal to one man, Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen president. Kadyrov, in turn, is loyal to Vladimir Putin, Russia's president. In fact, he's one of his most zealous allies. Under Kadyrov's iron grip, this private army has been deployed across various hotspots of Russia's wars, from Syria to Ukraine. These troops aren't just feared for their ruthlessness in combat, even civilians in Chechnya aren't spared from their brutal methods of keeping control. Accusations of human rights abuses follow them like a shadow. Torture, extrajudicial executions, and abductions are routine under their watch. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Kadyrov commanded around 19,000 of these ruthless fighters. In Ukraine, they've served in some of the most dangerous and brutal roles, often tasked with executing deserters or carrying out the most violent operations. Their deployment to the front lines of Kursk was part of a much larger effort to push back Ukrainian forces. These men didn't just fight, they were sent as symbols of Russia's resolve. They were there to hold the line in one of the most contested regions, to prove that no matter what, Kadyrov's forces would keep Russia's foothold intact. And yet, despite all that terrifying reputation, despite their unyielding brutality, they weren't killed by Ukrainian forces, they weren't captured or ambushed by the enemy. No, 8 of these hardened fighters were taken out by their own supposed allies. After all the bloodshed, after the years of being Russia's last line of defense, these dreaded Kadyrovites fell victim to a major case of oops. They were killed by North Korean soldiers who couldn't even tell a friend from foe. Talk about a cruel irony. A group of fighters feared for their ability to crush anyone in their path, mowed down by a bunch of poorly trained soldiers who were supposed to be on the same side. But how did this even happen? How could it go so horribly wrong? According to the GUR, the answer is as simple as it is disastrous: a language barrier. Yep, you heard that right. Language. The kind of thing you don't think about until you're stuck in a war zone, trying to stay alive, and your comrades can't understand a single word you're yelling. Although the GUR had always known the language barrier would be a problem, a ticking time bomb is perhaps more accurate. Russian officials thought they could pull off a miracle by integrating North Korean troops directly into their ranks, hoping that somehow, some way, things would work out. They'd given their new allies a crash course in military terms, teaching them about 100 key phrases like "back to your position," "fire," and "launch." It seems that this makeshift dictionary didn't cover "don't shoot your own guys" though. Funny how the basics always get left out. However, to be fair, North Korean soldiers didn't even understand the basic commands they were given. And remember, we're talking about life or death situations. That's why Lee Sung-kwon, a South Korean lawmaker, labeled the language barrier between the Russians and the North Koreans as more than an inconvenience. It was and is a straight-up nightmare. The fact that North Koreans couldn't even understand basic instructions was a disaster waiting to happen. And of course it did. The only surprise is that it took this long. After all, the North Koreans reportedly first saw combat in Ukraine as early as November 2024. Sure, they were only deployed to assist the Marine Corps and airborne forces in the Kursk Oblast. However, given their obvious incompetence, it's almost a miracle nothing disastrous happened straight away. Well, at least nothing that we know of. Joseph S. Bermudez Jr., a North Korean defense expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, isn't at all surprised at these developments. He put it bluntly: to conduct combat operations with an allied force that doesn't speak your language presents real problems, and no amount of military glossaries was going to fix that. You simply can't send two armies with zero common ground into battle and hope everything turns out peachy, especially when the language barrier is far from the only issue plaguing this dysfunctional alliance. In fact, this union never really stood a chance. Intercepted audio from October 2024 paints a pretty chaotic picture of the Russia-North Korea partnership from the get-go. In the leaked conversation, a Russian soldier doesn't mince words, complaining that the leaders had no clue what to do with the new North Korean recruits. Even worse, they had to make do with one interpreter for every 30 soldiers, hardly the ideal setup for any operation, let alone a war. The leaked audio, filled with expletive-laden frustration, captures the essence of just how disorganized and ill-prepared this alliance was from the beginning. But given who we're working with, it's no wonder the integration of North Korean troops into Russian forces has been nothing short of a disaster. On one side, you have Russian soldiers already beaten down by the war, tired, demoralized, and not exactly thrilled about the prospect of sharing their ranks with new comrades. The last part might have something to do with the rampant racism among Russian ranks. According to Bermudez, the Russian military has a significant level of racism, despite the country's wide ethnic diversity. This cultural disdain was evident from the start when North Korean soldiers were referred to as the Chinese in the leaked audio conversation we just discussed. Not getting someone's nationality correct isn't exactly the warmest welcome for an alliance, is it? Then again, think about who Russians were welcoming into their already pathetic ranks: soldiers with no battlefield experience, abysmal training, and terrible combat skills. Of course, that's not how these soldiers were sold to the Russians. Initial reports spoke of elite soldiers from the North Korean Storm Corps, hand-picked by the country's supreme leader, Kim Jong-un himself. The Storm Corps, for context, is North Korea's premier special forces unit. They're trained in infiltration, infrastructure sabotage, and assassinations. These soldiers are rigorously prepared to withstand high levels of physical pain and psychological torture, traits that make them formidable in specialized operations. In theory, they are a cut above the rest, ready to face any challenge with resilience. But here's the thing: even if a handful of Storm Corps soldiers were sent to Russia, they represent a tiny fraction of the total number of North Korean troops involved. And even that fraction likely doesn't contain the Storm Corps' finest members, as one North Korean defector put it. Now you might wonder, aren't special forces supposed to be the best of the best by their very definition? Well, yes and no. The Storm Corps, despite being North Korea's elite, is not a small, tight-knit group like the American Navy SEALs or the British SAS. Quite the contrary. The Storm Corps is a massive unit with anywhere from 40 to 80,000 soldiers. That's a far cry from the handful of highly trained commandos you might expect from a typical special forces group. So while they're certainly better trained than most of the North Korean military, they can't compare to the ultra-elite forces you'd find in other countries. It doesn't help that most of the forces deployed to Russia come from regular North Korean military units, as we mentioned. These units, despite their loyalty and indoctrination, have zero real combat experience. To put it bluntly, sending these soldiers to the front lines of the Russo-Ukrainian war is like sending lambs to the slaughter. But how is it possible for almost an entire military of 1.3 million active-duty soldiers to sorely lack battlefield experience? Well, the last time considerable North Korean forces participated in a war was over 70 years ago, the Korean War to be exact. Since then, they've had some overseas engagements, but they have been few and far between, and mostly in advisory or non-combat roles. For instance, North Korean troops were sent to Vietnam during the war, but only a few dozen were involved in direct combat. They also participated in minor roles in the Yom Kippur War and supported the Syrian government during its civil war. However, these engagements, while noteworthy, were limited in scale and scope. The numbers will tell you just how much. North Korea deployed fewer than 100 soldiers to Vietnam, 1,500 to Egypt, and just a handful to Syria and Uganda. Compare that with the 10,000 plus troops now sent to Russia, and you can see the mismatch. That's why experts like Mark Kantsian from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, describe the North Korean military as thoroughly indoctrinated but with low readiness. The troops being sent to Russia, even those from the Storm Corps, have not had the kind of hands-on, real-world combat experience that is vital on a modern battlefield. This lack of experience, especially when pitted against Ukraine's seasoned soldiers, makes it clear why casualties among these North Korean forces are expected to be brutal, and why killing their own allies is surely not the last error they'll make on this ill-fated deployment. Now, some experts claim that what these troops lack in combat experience they make up for with training, but let's break that claim down, shall we? Sure, the vaunted Storm Corps might have decent training, as these soldiers are put through intense physical and psychological endurance drills. They're trained to withstand pain, hunger, and mental torture in drills that would make any human being buckle under pressure. But here's the thing, none of that translates into battlefield effectiveness against modern forces. Endurance doesn't win battles when drones and missiles are flying overhead. The Storm Corps might hold the title of North Korea's pride, but against Ukraine's battle-hardened forces, they'll still be cannon fodder. And then there's the reality for most North Korean soldiers, the regulars. These guys are as green as they come. They're conscripted at 17 and serve for a decade, but it's not a decade of high-level military training. It's more about indoctrination and physical toughness than actual combat readiness. Even worse, many soldiers spend more time farming and doing manual labor than they do learning how to fight. Now let's talk about what Russia tried to do to fix this. It's simple, they tried to train them. Russian military bases in eastern Russia, from Usyrysk to Khabarovsk Krai, became the training grounds. Russian soldiers spent weeks with these North Koreans, trying to get them up to speed on Russian systems and the Ukrainian battlefield. But let's face it, even the best training in the world can't make up for years of missed experience. The North Koreans are still facing an environment they know nothing about, and tactics they've never seen. Sure, they can learn some basics, but will it really be enough to survive on a battlefield against seasoned and tech-savvy enemies? But the real kicker, the Russian military itself is in no shape to give proper training. The Kremlin is sending its troops to the front lines with barely enough time to train, and those same recruits are struggling just like the North Koreans. In this kind of chaos, the North Korean soldiers are going to be out of their depth no matter how much training they get. They might be better than the average Russian recruit, but that doesn't mean they stand a chance on the battlefield. Especially when they're also struggling with weapons they've been given. Ukrainian military intelligence reports that the North Korean soldiers near the Ukrainian border have been armed with standard infantry weapons, assault rifles, anti-tank missiles, and grenade launchers. On paper, it sounds like they're well equipped. But here's the catch, they haven't been trained to use them properly. Sure, Pyongyang has adopted many Soviet-era weapon systems, so there's a degree of familiarity there. But this isn't enough. These soldiers didn't sign up for a high-tech battlefield, and they certainly weren't prepared for one. On top of the usual weaponry, North Korean troops have received more advanced technology like night vision and thermal imaging devices. These are the kinds of tools that can turn the tide of battle in the right hands, but those aren't the right hands. North Korean soldiers aren't trained with this kind of gear. They don't spend their time learning to operate drones or high-tech military equipment. Their training back home didn't prepare them for these complex systems. As for their training in Russia, it might have allowed them to familiarize themselves with these advanced weapons, but certainly not master them. And in a war where seconds count and technology is king, that's a fatal flaw. That's also why the North Korean troops in Kursk are reportedly covered with first-person view FPV drones instead of being the ones operating them. And this is just a part of the North Korean woes in Russia. As expected, these troops, already under the iron fist of a brutal regime, are at the bottom of Russia's military hierarchy. They're essentially cannon fodder, expendable assets in Moscow's attempts to bolster its war effort. Russia is only using them as a buffer to cover its own losses. That's why daily reports are coming out of Kursk suggesting that these troops are taking heavy losses. On December 1st, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky acknowledged North Korean casualties. While Russia has attempted to keep the true scale of these losses under wraps, it's hard to hide the grim reality. Zelensky even claimed that Russia is going as far as burning the bodies of deceased North Korean soldiers in an effort to disguise the extent of the damage. He referred to it as burning their faces so no one could tell who they were. The North Korean soldiers in Russia are being treated with utter contempt, even in death. By December 14th, at least 200 of them were confirmed killed. But let's be honest, Putin doesn't care. He doesn't care about the soldiers dying from enemy or friendly fire, as long as they serve their purpose. For him, the North Korean troops are nothing more than expendable pawns in a broader geopolitical game. They're there to absorb casualties, draw attention away from Russian losses, and provide a temporary boost to the manpower Russia desperately needs. Their deaths, in his eyes, are just a small price to pay in the pursuit of his war objectives. That's why North Koreans are continuing to drop dead in Kursk. In fact, the losses are mounting daily. By December 17th, Ukrainian forces have reportedly killed 50 North Korean soldiers in Kursk over the span of just 3 days, with another 47 wounded. Yet this has done little to slow the Russian offensive. In fact, North Korea's own 94th Separate Brigade, which has been deployed in the region, continues to be replenished despite heavy losses. Their deaths, though tragic, seem to be an inevitable outcome of this grim alliance. And for the men from North Korea still fighting in Kursk, their chances of survival grow slimmer by the day. With this in mind, maybe the accidental killing killing of Russian soldiers wasn't an accident after all. Maybe it was a message. If we're going down, you're going down with us. Do you see this as a potential scenario? Or are the North Koreans just that incompetent? Share your thoughts in the comments section below.